The email arrived just as Caroline had set her coffee down, the steam rising in lazy swirls. She hadn't expected it. Not today, especially not after what had happened the last time they'd exchanged words. A few weeks ago, she'd sent a letter filled with her deepest doubts about her writing, how she was feeling lost and perhaps burned out. It was a dangerous thing to admit to someone you'd never met, and even more so when you were publicly known as someone who had it all together. But this anonymous author, the one who had somehow found a way to influence her, had pushed her to speak honestly, as if he understood exactly what she was going through. The last message he'd sent had made her question everything. He had written, asterisk, "The truth is you're not afraid to fail, Caroline. You're afraid of being irrelevant. You're afraid of no one caring anymore." Asterisk, those words had stung, cut through her like a blade, because they were true, painfully so. She hadn't written back since. She had wanted to, but she was terrified of what else he might see, what else he might uncover about her that she was still too afraid to admit to herself. She had tried to forget about him. She'd buried herself in her next novel, kept herself busy with book signings and interviews, but she couldn't shake that nagging feeling that somehow, in the silence between them, she was losing a battle with herself. So, sitting in the cafe this morning, she was caught off guard when the email notification blinked at the corner of her screen. A part of her wanted to ignore it, to close the laptop and go about her day. But there was another part of her, one that had spent sleepless nights wondering if she would ever find an answer to the strange connection she'd felt with this person, that was already clicking open the message before she could stop herself. "I think you need to know something, Caroline," the message began. Asterisk, "I'm not who you think I am." Asterisk. Her breath caught in her throat. The last few months, their letters had been filled with candid thoughts about life, philosophy, and writing. The unknown author had never hinted at anything being off, never let on that he wasn't exactly who he claimed to be. And now this. It was the kind of statement that could tear everything apart, the kind that would unravel months of carefully built trust. She stared at the screen for what felt like an eternity, the words on the page blurring as she blinked, unsure if this was a joke or something more serious. The seconds felt like hours as she scrolled down, her fingers trembling. The next line hit her like a punch in the gut. Asterisk, "The truth is, I'm not some fellow writer you're having a secret correspondence with. I'm someone who's been watching you for a long time. Someone who knows what you're hiding." Asterisk. Caroline's pulse quickened, her stomach dropping. The coffee she had just placed down was now forgotten, the sound of the bustling cafe fading into the background. This was not a typical fan email. This was something else entirely. Asterisk, "What do you mean? Who are you?" Asterisk, she typed, her heart pounding, her mind racing. She hit send before she could think it through. But the instant the email was out, she felt a knot in her chest, a feeling of dread creeping over her. The screen blinked back at her, the cursor still there, waiting for a response. The quiet of the cafe had never felt so loud. It didn't take long for the reply to come. Less than 2 minutes later, her screen blinked with a new message, and before Caroline could convince herself to leave it unread, her eyes were glued to the words that had appeared in her inbox. She almost couldn't bring herself to breathe as she read the opening line. Asterisk, "I knew you'd be surprised. But I also knew you'd have questions. You always do." Asterisk. The calmness of the response unnerved her. It was as though he knew exactly how she would react, like he had anticipated this moment in their strange, unspoken relationship. She tried to push the growing sense of unease aside and kept reading. Asterisk. "The truth is, I've been following your career for years, Caroline. Not as a fan, not as a fellow writer, but as someone who sees what you're hiding. You want to know what it is? You want to know why you've been feeling this way? Because you've been running from your own truth for too long. And I'm the one who can help you face it." Asterisk. Her fingers froze over the keyboard. The weight of the words settled on her shoulders like a heavy burden. She wanted to laugh it off, dismiss it as a joke, but the more she read, the more she realized there was something deeper behind this, something she couldn't ignore. She wasn't sure whether to be furious, terrified, or just utterly confused. How could this person know her so well? How could he say these things with such certainty? Caroline's mind raced, and the sharp hum of the cafe around her seemed to dull. She could still hear the clinking of mugs, the low murmur of conversation, but it all felt distant, as if the world had stopped moving and she was the only one left in it. suspended in this strange, disorienting conversation. She didn't know who this person was, but she knew they had somehow gotten inside her head, had pushed her to a place she wasn't sure she wanted to go. She typed a quick response, trying to regain some control. Asterisk, who are you? What do you want from me? Asterisk, she hit send, but the second the words left her fingertips, she regretted it. She knew better than to ask questions like that, not to someone who had already shown they knew more about her than she was comfortable with. But there was no turning back now. Seconds later, another reply arrived. This time, it came with a kind of directness that made her heart skip a beat. Asterisk, you already know who I am, Caroline. That's the thing, isn't it? You've known all along, but you've been too afraid to admit it. Asterisk. Caroline's stomach churned. Her fingers gripped the edges of the table, her mind spinning. The cafe, the noise, everything began to feel like a blur as she focused entirely on the words on her screen. She was beginning to question whether this had all been some kind of elaborate setup. Was someone playing a game with her? Was this some twisted fan fiction or some kind of psychological test? But how could they know so much? How could anyone understand her like this stranger seemed to? She couldn't explain it, but a part of her felt exposed, like this person had taken pieces of her soul and twisted them into words. That wasn't something anyone could fake. It wasn't something that could come from just reading her books or watching her public appearances. Asterisk, don't be so quick to dismiss this. You're about to hear something that's going to change everything for you. All these years, you've been chasing the wrong things. The success, the accolades, the recognition. But deep down, you've known that it's never enough. You've always felt like you were pretending, like you were a fraud. You've been hiding your truth from everyone, even yourself. Asterisk. Her hands shook as she read the words. This wasn't just an author giving her writing advice or a fan asking for tips on how to succeed. This was someone who had seen her, not just the image she projected, but the person underneath it. The truth she had buried for so long. The walls of the cafe felt smaller now, the air thicker. Caroline's breath came faster as she tried to understand who this was. She had a few suspicions. Maybe this was someone she had met in passing, someone who knew a little too much about her life. But no, the things they were saying, they were too personal, too sharp. This wasn't someone who had been watching her from afar. This was someone who had been inside her mind. Caroline wiped her face with the back of her hand, as if she could shake away the tension that was starting to rise within her. She could hear her heartbeat in her ears, the thudding rhythm matching the pounding in her chest. This was too much. It had gone too far. She didn't know who this person was, but she could feel that they were pushing her to a breaking point. She had to stop it. She had to stop replying. But the truth was, she couldn't. She was addicted to this conversation, to the way it made her question everything she had believed in, everything she had thought she was. She typed another response, but this time, she didn't feel in control. It was more like she was typing out her thoughts, her raw, unfiltered thoughts, without any real filter. Asterisk, what do you want from me? Why are you doing this? Asterisk. And then, as if he had been waiting for her to ask that exact question, the response came. But this time, it was different. There was no judgment, no cryptic insight, just a simple, brutal truth. Asterisk, I want you to stop hiding. I want you to stop pretending that you've got it all together. I want you to face what you've been avoiding. You've always been afraid of being vulnerable, but vulnerability is the only way out. It's the only way you'll ever find peace. Asterisk. For a moment, Caroline stared at the screen, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. The words were simple, but they hit her like a hammer. She didn't know what to do with them, didn't know how to respond. She had spent her entire career building a wall around herself, carefully crafting a public persona that was flawless, perfect, controlled. And now this person, this stranger, was telling her that none of it mattered, that it was all just a mask. She wanted to close her laptop, to walk away from it all. But deep down, she knew she couldn't. She had been running from something for so long, and now it was finally in front of her. The truth. And for the first time in a long time, Caroline wasn't sure she was ready to face it. The words on the screen stared back at Caroline, their simplicity somehow more suffocating than the most elaborate prose. Her hands trembled, and she closed her eyes, trying to steady her breath. She could still hear the quiet buzz of the cafe around her, the murmur of voices, the clinking of cutlery, but it all felt miles away now. There was a pressure in her chest, a sense of dread she hadn't felt in years. She wanted to ignore it, to shut the laptop and walk away, but something in the pit of her stomach was telling her not to. The pull of this strange conversation was undeniable. She had no idea what she was doing, but it felt like she was on the edge of something too important to ignore. She leaned forward, hands hovering over the keyboard, but she didn't type immediately. Instead, she stared at the screen for what felt like forever, wrestling with herself. She had lived her life in control, had built a career around the illusion of knowing exactly what she was doing. Yet, here she was, sitting in the middle of a bustling cafe, unsure of what to do next. How had this stranger gotten under her skin so easily? She had spent years managing her image, making sure the public saw only the version of herself she wanted them to. But now, this anonymous figure had pulled back the curtain and was pointing out all the cracks in the facade she had worked so hard to perfect. She could almost hear his voice in her head, as if he were right there beside her, whispering the things she hadn't allowed herself to think. "Stop pretending," he had said. Stop hiding. It's time to face the truth. But facing the truth wasn't as simple as it sounded. Caroline had spent her whole life carefully curating her story, building a narrative that made sense to others, a narrative that made her feel safe. It wasn't a lie. It was just an incomplete version of who she really was. She had always believed that if she kept up the right image, if she stayed focused on her work and her public persona, then the cracks would never show. But this was different. This wasn't about her books or her public image. This was about something deeper, something more uncomfortable. She shook her head, frustrated by the confusion that clouded her mind. Her fingers pressed against the keys again, but she hesitated. What do you mean? She typed. Her words clipped. What truth are you talking about? Almost immediately, the response came. The truth that you've been running from your entire life. The fear that if you stop pretending, people will see the person you're trying to hide. The fear that if you stop being perfect, you won't be loved, you won't be enough. You've spent so long burying that fear beneath your work, but it's always there, gnawing at you. And the only way to get rid of it is to confront it. Caroline's heart began to race, and the room seemed to close in on her once again. It was as if the air had grown thick, heavy with the weight of his words. Her mind felt like it was spinning in circles, each thought competing for her attention. This person, whoever they were, had done something that no one else ever had. They had gotten past the walls she'd built, past all the defenses she had carefully crafted over the years. She had always prided herself on being in control, on knowing what was coming next. But now, she felt utterly vulnerable, exposed in a way that made her want to run, to escape from everything. But she couldn't. She wasn't sure why, but she couldn't. A sudden wave of anger rose in her chest, the frustration she had been suppressing for so long finally breaking free. "You don't know me," she typed, her fingers slamming against the keys. You don't know anything about my life. So stop acting like you do. The response was almost immediate. I know more than you think. I've watched you long enough to see the cracks. I know about the nights you spend staring at your screen, wondering if anyone will ever understand. I know about the way you smile in public, and how your eyes give away everything when you're alone. You can't hide from me, Caroline. I'm not just anyone. I'm the truth you've been avoiding. And now, you're going to have to face it. The words hit her like a physical blow. Caroline recoiled, feeling as if she'd been slapped across the face. How could he know all of that? How could anyone understand so much without ever having been inside her life? She didn't know what to believe anymore. She had never felt so exposed, so vulnerable, yet at the same time, she couldn't ignore the nagging sensation that this person was right. She had spent so long hiding, so long pretending to be someone she wasn't. She had built an empire on that persona, had convinced the world, and herself, that she was exactly what they wanted her to be. But here, in this strange conversation, the truth felt unavoidable. She slammed the laptop shut, but the image of those words, the harshness of them, lingered in her mind. The cafe was suddenly too loud, the noise of the patrons too much. She couldn't escape it. Not the message, not the thoughts that were now racing through her head. She wanted to leave, wanted to escape, but her feet felt rooted to the floor, as if the very weight of her own fears had trapped her in place. For the first time in a long time, she didn't know what to do. This wasn't a problem she could solve with her usual tactics, with more books or more appearances or more awards. This was something deeper, something that couldn't be fixed by success or accolades. It was about her. It was about who she was beneath the surface, and she wasn't sure if she was ready to face that person. But as she sat there, trying to push the thoughts away, she realized something. She couldn't run anymore. She had spent her entire life running from herself, from the things she feared, and now it was time to stop. Whether she was ready or not, the truth had found her, and it wasn't going away. Caroline left the cafe in a daze. The streets outside felt different now, as if the world had shifted around her while she had been sitting inside. She walked without really thinking, her feet moving on autopilot, each step echoing with a kind of numbness. Her mind was still reeling from the conversation. She couldn't make sense of it all. Part of her wanted to scream, to shout at the stranger who had so easily gotten inside her head, unraveling years of carefully constructed walls. She had never felt so helpless, so vulnerable. And yet, in a strange way, she also felt a shift. Something had changed in her. A part of her that had been dormant for years, buried beneath layers of fear and self-doubt, had stirred awake. But how could she move forward when she was unsure of what exactly she was facing? The walk back to her apartment felt endless, the weight of her thoughts pressing down on her chest like an unbearable burden. She barely noticed the familiar sights of the city around her, the towering buildings, the busy intersections, the people rushing past. She was lost in the conversation, in the words that had unsettled her more than she was willing to admit. Who was this person? How had they known all of that about her? She had tried to convince herself that it didn't matter, that she could just brush it off. But deep down, she knew that wasn't true. This wasn't something she could ignore. When she finally reached her apartment, she collapsed onto the couch, her laptop still sitting on the coffee table in front of her. She stared at it, as if it were an alien object that had somehow wormed its way into her life. Her hands trembled as she reached for it, her mind racing. She didn't know if she was ready to continue the conversation, but she knew one thing for sure. She couldn't just leave it hanging. Something was telling her that this person had more to reveal, more to say, and she wasn't sure if it was something she could walk away from. She opened her laptop again, her fingers hovering above the keyboard. She didn't know what to expect. Another cryptic message, another personal attack, maybe? But when the screen loaded, she was met with something different. There was no new message from the stranger, no mysterious words to unsettle her. Instead, there was something far more unexpected, a video. Her heart skipped a beat as she clicked the play button, her breath caught in her throat. The screen flickered for a moment, and then a familiar face appeared, someone she hadn't seen in years. It was her brother, David. Caroline blinked in disbelief, her mind struggling to process what she was seeing. David had disappeared from her life years ago. He had walked away, choosing a path that had led him far from the family he had once been so close to. Caroline had tried to reach out to him, had tried to understand why he had left, but he had never responded. And now, here he was, staring back at her from the screen, as if he had never been gone at all. "Caroline," he said, his voice calm but tinged with something else. "Regret? Sorrow?" It was hard to tell. "I'm sorry it had to be like this, but I needed to explain everything. You were never meant to be dragged into this, but it's too late to go back now. You need to hear this, whether you're ready or not." Caroline's breath caught in her throat as she tried to make sense of the words. What was happening? Why was her brother, the one person who had left her life behind, the one to deliver this message? Her mind raced, but the video continued, David speaking directly into the camera. "I'm the one who's been writing to you. All these months, it's been me. I never meant for it to go this far, but I couldn't stop. I couldn't help myself. I had to get through to you, to make you understand. And now, I know I've pushed you too far." His voice cracked slightly, the emotion leaking through in a way that felt raw and unfiltered. "I've been watching you, Caroline, for a long time. I've seen how you've struggled, how you've buried everything that's real inside of you, just to keep going. I couldn't watch you do that anymore. You deserve to know the truth, even if it hurts." The room spun around Caroline as she tried to absorb what she was hearing. Her mind was a whirlwind of confusion and disbelief. This wasn't just some random stranger, some mysterious author hiding behind a screen. This was her brother, the same brother who had abandoned her, who had left her family without a word. And now he was here, telling her that he had been the one behind all of it, The anonymous letters, the cryptic messages, everything. Her fingers gripped the edge of the couch as her breath came faster, panic rising in her chest. "Why?" she whispered, the question slipping out before she could stop herself. David's face softened, a pained expression crossing his features. "I had to, Caroline. I had to do this because I knew you wouldn't listen to me any other way. I know what you've been hiding, what you've been running from, and I needed you to face it." Tears welled up in Caroline's eyes, and for the first time in years, she felt something like a chokehold around her throat, something that wasn't just fear or anger, but a deep, aching sadness. She had always felt the emptiness of David's absence, the weight of his disappearance in her life, but this was something else entirely. "You couldn't just talk to me?" she asked, her voice breaking. "You couldn't just come to me and tell me all of this face to face?" David sighed, looking down for a moment before looking back up at the camera. "I couldn't, Caroline. I wasn't ready, and I didn't think you would ever understand. I thought maybe, if I pushed you, if I made you confront what you've been hiding from, you'd finally hear me. But I see now that it's too much. I'm sorry. I never wanted to hurt you." Caroline stared at the screen, her body frozen in place. This was too much to process, too much to handle all at once. Her mind was reeling, trying to make sense of everything, but it felt like the ground had shifted beneath her, and she was falling into a chasm that she wasn't sure she could climb out of. And yet, deep down, a small part of her understood. This wasn't just a cruel game, a manipulation. David was trying to reach her. He was trying to pull her out of the shell she had built around herself, trying to force her to confront the truth that she had spent her life avoiding. He was trying to help her heal, even if it hurt, even if it meant breaking her heart again. Caroline sat motionless, staring at the screen as David's image faded into silence. Her heart pounded, the weight of his confession pressing down on her chest like an unrelenting force. She couldn't bring herself to look away from the blank screen, as if doing so would make the truth vanish, as if ignoring it could erase the moment she had just witnessed. But the truth was inescapable now. Her brother, the one person she had spent years wondering about, the one who had abandoned her without explanation, had been the one behind the anonymous messages. He had been the one to push her, to force her to face what she had been running from. She couldn't understand it. She didn't know how to feel. Her emotions swirled in a chaotic mix of anger, disbelief, and something else, something she hadn't expected, a deep, aching sadness. The apartment was quiet, the hum of the city outside barely audible, but the silence inside felt deafening. Caroline had no idea how much time had passed since she had watched the video, but when she finally moved, it was as though her body had been frozen in place for hours. She got up slowly, her legs weak beneath her, and walked to the window. She couldn't look at the laptop anymore. It felt too much like an invasion, a violation of something too personal. Her reflection stared back at her in the glass, but it didn't feel like her. It felt like a stranger. The person she had been, the person she had built herself into, was gone. She was no longer the successful, controlled author everyone thought they knew. She was just Caroline, the one who had been hiding from herself for so long. The revelation about David, about everything that had been hidden from her, was a brutal awakening. All those years she had spent trying to make sense of why he had left, why he had never come back, and now the answers were here, staring her in the face. It hurt more than she had ever imagined. But at the same time, there was something freeing about it. Her brother had forced her to confront the part of herself she had kept buried. He had shown her the truth she had been avoiding for so long, and while it was painful, it was also necessary. For the first time in years, Caroline didn't feel the need to hide. She didn't have to keep pretending that everything was perfect, that she was fine. She didn't have to pretend that the emptiness she had been carrying around didn't exist. David had been right. It was time to face it, to stop running from the truth. But it wasn't just about her relationship with her brother. It was about her entire life, about the fear that had kept her locked in a cycle of self-doubt and avoidance. She had spent so long focusing on her image, on maintaining the perfect exterior for the world to see, that she had lost sight of who she really was beneath it all. She had buried her true self under layers of success and public admiration, believing that if she kept pushing forward, she could outrun her fears. But David had shattered that illusion. And in doing so, he had given her the chance to start over, to rebuild herself in a way that was real. Caroline walked back to the couch, where her laptop still sat, the screen now dark. She opened it again, feeling a strange calm settle over her. There was no more confusion, no more second-guessing. She knew what she had to do. She clicked open her inbox and typed a simple message to David, her fingers steady as she composed the words. I'm angry. I'm hurt. But I understand now. I see what you were trying to do, even if I didn't want to. Thank you for forcing me to face it. For making me see what I've been running from. She paused before hitting send. She wasn't sure if David would ever see it, or if it would make a difference. But it didn't matter. For the first time in years, she felt like she was taking control of her own life again. The anger she had felt earlier, the confusion, was still there, but it was no longer overwhelming. It was a part of her healing, part of the process she needed to go through. She had to confront the anger, the pain, and the fear before she could truly move forward. When she clicked send, it wasn't just a message to her brother. It was a message to herself, a declaration that she was no longer going to hide, no longer going to pretend. She was going to face the truth, even if it was uncomfortable, even if it was difficult, because that was the only way she could move forward. And as she sat there, watching the message disappear into the ether, Caroline felt a sense of release, like a weight had been lifted from her shoulders. It wasn't the kind of resolution she had expected. It wasn't the happy ending she had imagined for herself, but it was real. And in that raw, imperfect truth, she found a kind of peace. David had forced her to see what she had been avoiding. And while the journey to face herself wasn't going to be easy, Caroline knew now that it was the only path that would lead her to the freedom she had been searching for. She didn't know what the future held, or what kind of relationship she would have with her brother going forward, but she knew this. She wasn't the same person she had been when this all started. She had broken free from the prison she had built around herself, and for the first time in a long time, she felt like she was finally ready to live